We're continuing our study of the people of faith in Hebrews chapter 11. In our last two studies, we saw faith on display among the judges of Israel. Today, we see an example of faith from among their kings, David. In Hebrews 11, verse 32, it says, "The time would fail me to tell," and mentions David as one of those that would fail him the time to tell of. And there's so much that we could see about the example of David that even today we'd be failed if we tried to cover all the examples of faith that we find in David's life. We don't have any mention for us here in the book of Hebrews 11, so we'll simply go back and consider the examples that we can find during his life. As we begin, there's probably no better place to begin when it comes to the faith of David than considering what David did by faith when it came to defeating Goliath. In 1 Samuel chapter 17, we find the giant of stature versus the giant of faith. In verses 4 through 7, we are introduced to Goliath as a champion of the Philistines. He was a giant of a man, standing around 9.5 feet tall, with giant armor and weapons to match. In verses 8 through 10, he defied Israel and challenged any one of them to come fight him. Well, verse 11 says, "When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid." And verse 12 begins by saying, "Now David." David was different from all these others. He was the youngest of 8 sons. In verses 17 and 18, we see where his father sent him to check on his oldest 3 brothers who were part of Saul's army. In verse 23, Goliath came out and issued a challenge while he was there in the camp. In verse 26, we begin to get an insight of the faith of David. When David asked in regard to Goliath, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of a living God?" Then we see a little bit later when Saul found out about David, that David went to Saul and said to him in verse 32, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." Now, you can imagine David, being a boy, telling Saul the king this. In verse 33, Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him." And David basically says, "Yes, I am." He mentioned how he had defeated, with the Lord's help, a lion and a bear before. And in verse 37, he said, "The Lord, who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." You see, God had proven himself to be with David before, and by faith, David believed that he would be with him again. Well, then as we continue, we see where David and Goliath meet off. We see where Goliath was a little put off by the fact that this boy had been sent out to him. He felt it was an insult to him, and basically told David, "You just come on and I'll feed you to the birds." But notice what David said as he stood toe-to-toe with this giant Goliath. He said, "You come to me with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, and that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." Verse 48, "So it was, and the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, that David hastened and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine." Interestingly, a few verses earlier in verse 24, we see the men of fear ran from the giant, where here David, the man of faith, ran toward the giant. And like the judge Barak last week, who ran toward the chariots, David ran toward the source of opposition. In verses 49 through 50, we see where David put his hand into his bag and took out a stone, and he slung it and struck the Philistine in his forehead, so that the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. Interestingly, after that, in verses 52 and 53, the men of Israel who were fearful now were courageous, full of enough courage to go and pursue the Philistines. And that ought to be an example to us today. that at times when others may lack faith around us, when we demonstrate the proper faith, we can be a source of encouragement to them. Really, we have a choice. Either we can be discouraged by the faithless, or we can encourage by our faith. The giant of faith found victory against the giant of stature. Just one example of faith in the life of David. As we continue with David, we also see that by faith David honored Saul. Now, while David's victory over Goliath was definitely good for Israel, Saul did not see it as good for him. And here in 1 Samuel 18, when the women praised David more than Saul, we notice Saul's response. In verses 6 through 9, we read where, "Then Saul was very angry, and the saying displeased him. So Saul eyed David from that time forward." And there's so much in that statement there that he eyed David from that time forward. If you read verses 10 and 11, the very next day Saul tried to kill David. Then in the following verses 17, 21, and 25, Saul then tried to put David in harm's way so the Philistines would kill him. And we see a statement of summary in verse 29. Saul was David's enemy continually. As we come into chapter 19, we read that Saul told Jonathan, his son, and all his servants to put David to death. Well, verse 10, Saul himself tried to kill David again, and David stayed on the run, trying to evade Saul's attempts to kill him. Now think about this. You have someone who's treating you as their enemy, who's after you, trying to kill you, turning others against you. How would you respond to such a man? Well, let's continue to chapter 24, because we find here in chapter 24 that while pursuing David, Saul unknowingly went into a cave where David and his men were hiding. And David's men said, maybe what we would expect to be said in such a circumstance. In verse 4, "This is the day of which the Lord said to you, Behold, I will deliver your enemy into your hand, that you may do to him as it seems good to you." So what did David do? Kill Saul? No, David arose and secretly cut off a corner of Saul's robe. That's all he could find the strength and the courage to do. Well, it wasn't much about strength and courage as it was his attitude and respect for Saul. Because you see in verses 5 and 6, it bothered David that he even did this to King Saul. In verse 7, he restrained his men from doing anything to Saul. And after Saul left the cave and David came out after him, notice how he addressed Saul. In verse 7, he said to him, "My lord, the king." And he also stooped with his face to the ground and bowed down. Now, why would David respond this way to a man who'd been trying to kill him and having others try to kill him? Well, in verses 6 and also 10, we find out why. David said there, "The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, to stretch out my hand against him, seeing he is the anointed of the Lord." God had anointed Saul as king, and by faith David honored him as king. In fact, he goes on to say in verses 12 and 15, "Let the Lord judge between you and me." By faith, David not only honored Saul as king, but let God take care of anything that needed to be done in the situation between him and Saul. That's how David, by faith, honored Saul. But not just on this occasion. We continue a few chapters later. We come to chapter 26, and we find again Saul is once again pursuing David. In verse 5, David found Saul and his men sleeping. And in verses 6 and 7, he and Abishai, one of his men, went down to Saul, creeping through his men to work his way to Saul, with all of his men sleeping around him. And in verses 8 and 9, when Abishai wanted to kill Saul, David said, "Do not destroy him, for who can stretch out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be without guilt?" You see, as verse 10 indicates, by faith David said God would take care of Saul, as he had said earlier. And in verses 17 through 19, he again addressed Saul as "my lord, the king," and found him and referred to himself as Saul's servant. In spite of the fact that Saul was after David, trying to kill him and hated him, David honored Saul because of his position as the anointed, the chosen one of God to be in this position of leadership. And we learn the same principles for us today in the New Testament. In Romans chapter 13, 1 Peter 3, and other passages command us to show the same honor to those who rule over us. And we're demonstrating a lack of faith in God's rule over the affairs of man when we fail to honor a governing authority appointed by him. May we demonstrate the faith of David, even though our lives aren't near as in jeopardy as his was. And may we honor the king as we're told to do. David definitely did, and he's an example of that kind of faith to us. And also as we continue in David's life, we see that by faith David overcame adversity. One example of this is in chapter 29 and 30 of 1 Samuel. In chapter 29, we see where David and his men prepared for battle, but they were not trusted, were rejected, and sent home. And as we come to 1 Samuel 30, we see what they found after they returned home, rejected from battle. Beginning verse 1, when David and his men came to the city, behold, it was burned with fire, and their wives and their sons and their daughters had been taken captive. In verse 4, then David and the people who were with him lifted their voices and wept until there was no strength in them to weep. I mean, imagine, what if you were to return home to your city and find your city burned and your family gone and missing? No wonder they responded with such despondency. And to make matters worse, keep reading in verse 6. Moreover, David was greatly distressed because the people spoke of stoning him. For all the people were embittered, each one because of his sons and his daughters. They seemingly blamed David for what had happened, maybe because they felt he should have protected them better. But how would you feel at this point if you were David? You were rejected from fighting in battle, you find your city burned, your family gone, and all your people, the ones you thought were your friends, now turn against you. How do you deal with such a situation? Well, a lot of it depends on where is your faith. As we continue to read here, we see in verse 6, but David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. As one commentator said, his faith supplied him with inward resources of comfort and energy. And we see that David inquired of the Lord about the situation, saying, shall I pursue this band? Shall I overtake them? And he said to him, pursue, for you will surely overtake them, and you will surely rescue all. So what does this man do who's dejected over the burning of his city and the hijacking of his family? When God tells him go, David did. Verse 9 says, so David went. And in verse 10, David pursued, he and 400 men. Now, we do not know how large the troop was that they were pursuing, but in verse 16, we read that they were large enough to be spread out over all the land. And so what does David with his 400 men do to this great troop of men? Well, verse 17 says, David attacked them from twilight until the evening of the next day. Not a man of them escaped, except 400 young men who rode on camels and fled. Now, this verse implies that the 400 who escaped were a very small part of the total. And remember, David only had 400 men to begin with. And how did he respond to such a great victory over these Amalekites? Well, in verse 23, he gave the credit to God when he spoke of what the Lord has given us, who has preserved us and delivered into our hand the troop that came against us. Once again, we see the faith of David, where here by faith turned tragedy into triumph. And as we continue in the life of David, another example of faith we see is how he prepared for the temple. In 2 Samuel 7, we read where David wanted to personally build a permanent house for the Lord. But God said it wasn't to be him, but it would be done by his son. Verse 13 in 2 Samuel 7 said, referring to David's son, that he shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. So how did David respond? Something he wanted to do, the Lord told him he couldn't, but his son would? Well, in verse 28 of 2 Samuel 7, David said, "And now, O Lord God, you are God, and your words are true, and you have promised this goodness to your servant." David took God's word as being true, knowing that the promise would be fulfilled. And so when God promised, by faith David knew that the words would be and acted accordingly. We come to 1 Chronicles now, in chapter 28. And there in verses 11 through 13, we see what David did that demonstrated his faith in what God had told him about his son being the one who would build the temple. We read there, "Then David gave his son Solomon the plans for the vestibule, its houses, its treasuries, its upper chambers, its inner chambers, and the place of the mercy seat." In verses 14 through 18, it refers to the fact that he gave gold, also silver. Now, if you go to the next chapter, we see even more details about how much David gave for the building of this house of God, the temple, that he would never personally see. In chapter 29, verses 2 through 4, David said, "Now for the house of my God, I have prepared with all my might, gold for things to be made of gold, silver for things of silver, bronze for things of bronze, iron for things of iron, wood for things of wood, onyx stones, stones to be set, glistening stones of various colors, all kinds of precious stones and marble slabs in abundance." And what did David then tell Solomon? On verse 20, he said to his son, "Be strong and of good courage, and do it. Do not fear nor be dismayed, for the Lord my God, will be with you. He will not leave you nor forsake you until you have finished all the work for the service of the house of the Lord." By faith, David knew that his son would build the temple. David could see it as well as done, and he was willing to put forth the effort in preparing all the plans and giving all the gold and the other elements that were needed in its building, all by faith. He physically couldn't see the temple, but by faith he could, and prepared for its construction. Have you seen heaven? Well, maybe not literally, but by faith have you? Are you preparing for it in a way that demonstrates your faith in it? You see, there's so many ways that by faith David did these and other great things in his life. And by faith, we can do great things as well if we'll learn from his example and act accordingly.